I would love the next speaker, since I think it's going to tie beautifully into the topics that Chris just touched upon. She's the CFO of AstraZeneca. Aradhana, Sarin, please join us. And later on, I'll invite Chip. Please join us at the podium. Thank you from Wall Street Journal.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. I actually thought Chip's presentation was really nice and did tie into some of the things I'm going to cover. So I'm going to talk a little bit give you a brief overview of what AstraZeneca is. I'm sure many of you have heard of the company, and then go into the sort of topic for today, which is how and where are we using AI. I won't necessarily go into some of the challenges, whether it's data and security and so forth, but happy to address that as well. All right, so this is in quick snapshot what AstraZeneca is. It's a large pharmaceutical company, about $200 billion in market cap. For the first 9 months of the year, we did about $40 billion in revenues. The revenues you can see on the pie charts below is a very diverse, both from a therapy area standpoint as well as from a geographic standpoint. So we generate about 40% of our revenue from the US, but it is fairly broad geographically. Similarly, from a therapeutic area standpoint, we have defined 5 areas where we are leaders and committed to be leaders. Oncology is a big part of that. Oncology and rare diseases, which are more on the specialty side. And then cardiovascular renal medicines, metabolic diseases sort of being part of that, respiratory and inhaled medicine, and then immune therapies as well. So why is AstraZeneca positioned to win? At the very bottom, you see this $80 billion ambition. So we, in May of this year, went very bold and very ambitious and set out a goal for ourselves of achieving $80 billion in revenue by 2030. And that's almost doubling the size of our revenue base. So that's a big, big bold step that we took. And what gives us confidence that we may be able to achieve that bold ambition? First and foremost, as I mentioned, we have a diversified portfolio. I talked about the therapy areas. We're diversified geographically. We're diversified from a therapy area standpoint. We have a very innovative pipeline. We spend close to $12 billion in R&D. This last quarter, we spent $3 billion in R&D for that quarter. We have over 200 clinical studies in late stage, so phase 2, phase 3, which obviously there's always risk with studies, but there are 200 studies going on right now. And as part of that $80 billion ambition, we have the goal to launch 20 new medicines. So these are new molecular entities that we expect to launch. We're continuing to not only invest in achieving that 2030 ambition, but looking what's beyond that. So a lot of new therapy areas, whether it's cell therapy, oligonucleotides, radiopharmaceuticals, et cetera. We're, in addition to the phase 2, 3 studies that we have, we're also investing in what would be the next generation of therapies. And then, we're supported obviously by great colleagues across the globe. And I'll touch a little bit at the end towards our sustainability ambitions. But I would say in our industry, we're leading and again, setting very bold ambition for our sustainability agenda. So I'll cover that a little bit towards the end. So how will we get to $80 billion? And there are obviously some headwinds. You can see the down arrow there. The IRA, which, again, people who are familiar with the pharma industry know there are some headwinds relating to the IRA, so that will impact us, as well as pharma goes through its cycles every few years. So we have a few medicines that will lose patent protection. But at the same time, we expect a lot of growth from our existing medicines. So these are medicines that are already launched in the market. Our respiratory portfolio is a good example of that, where we have brands like Tezspire and Fasenra and Safnello and so forth, which just launched in the last 3 years and still have long, long runways to go to continue to grow and serve the market. And then the new medicines, which is the 20 new medicines that I mentioned, will add on top of that. And then beyond 2030, like I said, we're continuing to invest in a lot of different modalities. You may have heard about antibody drug conjugates, which is this new technology of almost, it's also been called smart chemotherapy or targeted chemotherapy. So really, replacing traditional chemotherapy with these ADC products. So that's the bold ambition, and we're on track to do that. Then I will come to AI, and we are, AI is obviously been a new word last few years, but in some areas, computational discovery and so forth had already been going on for many years. But when you think of the value chain of how pharma companies operate and discover drugs and create value, we're trying to use, and this lists a few examples, and I'll get into details, essentially from the very process of what's done in the lab, the discovery, the research, the looking through papers that Chris talked about, for example. So everything from early drug discovery and then drug development, which maybe is a little bit more challenging, but there are some areas where we can apply AI, through to the process of CMC, which is the supply chain and the quality of manufacturing, and that generally goes in parallel with drug research. And then on the commercial side, with market access and with improving the patient experience, with the drugs. So I'll cover 4 of these areas and get into a little bit more detail to give you a flavor of what we're doing. So the first one is in accelerating R&D. And examples where we're using AI are generating documents and a lot of analysis on structural biology and looking through instead of actually having to create 500 different molecules and then testing each of these molecules against a particular target, you could design them in silico and in an AI form and try to test all of them and then actually create only half a dozen of them and test those. So again, reducing the time that's required in the early phase of research. The place where, unfortunately, I know there's been a lot said on how AI will change the world of pharmaceuticals. I actually still think it's going to be very, very difficult. And the reason I say that is when you look at the 10 years, somewhere between 8 and 10 years required from bench to getting a drug to the market. When you look at and estimates have been rising, the $2 billion that's required, again, from bench to getting a drug to the market. The failure rate of discoveries, where less than 2% of things that are discovered in lab actually make it to market. Unfortunately, not a whole lot of that's going to change, because even if you discover and are more productive in that research phase, you still need to test it in animals. You still need to test it in healthy volunteers. You still need to test it in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So that portion of the pipeline and getting new drugs to market, unfortunately, cannot be shrunk. There are places there where, so this document example where you can shrink things. So a good example where we're applying it is in regulatory filing. So dossiers that we submit to the FDA are generally 3,000 to 4,000 pages long. And tens of people work on that for 3 months on end to actually produce those dossier pulling tables and data tables and the results of the trials and so forth and CMC all together. And we're now starting to use AI to generate sort of a first draft of that. Similarly, when we do regulatory filings, we're not doing the filing only, obviously, at the FDA. We're filing with the EMA. We're filing in Japan and other countries. So using, again, AI to take that first draft and have it translated in various languages enables us to file faster for approval in other places. The last example here, which actually we partnered with a company called Cure AI, is, and this, so I think there are going to be a lot of applications in actually service delivery, so not the pharma side necessarily, but the actual patient care. And particularly in early sort of screening, diagnosis, et cetera, oftentimes patients go through 2-3 different specialists. It may take months to actually get an accurate diagnosis. And what we did with this is, you can train AI models on thousands of X-rays, and once it's trained, it can pick up not just sort of what the X-ray originally was for, but also early signs of lung cancer. So you can get that early read from. So I think from a diagnostic standpoint, it would really transform healthcare delivery. The next couple of examples are in the supply chain. So this is in manufacturing. And again, we're using this from a drug development standpoint. So when we do drug development, so while it's still in the clinical phase, at the same time, in parallel, you're optimizing the manufacturing because you need a manufacturing that's able to withstand 500 billion times more production volume versus what you did in the lab. And so how do you optimize the process to reduce it from, say, 50 chemistry steps to 10 chemistry steps? And so we're using AI on that. Obviously, on yield, this thing that's written here on digital twins. So this is interesting. Again, what we've done is replicated our supply chains, which again are very complex because you're getting certain API from somewhere. You're doing different steps in different locations. You're shipping all over the globe, and reproducing that process digitally, and then looking at where are the bottlenecks or where is there risk, if additional supply was needed in Japan and so forth. So making that process more efficient. Finance, again, this is much more, as finance, the world of finance itself is shifting. We're using AI, and so are a lot of other people on, again, automating controls, automating sort of invoice matching. So a lot of the stuff that in the past, I think was done in offshore centers or less automated will become more and more automated. We're also trying to get it to performance reporting, where, again, normally an analyst or an associate would take that data and say, okay, what's the variances and so forth, right? You can generate a lot of that along with the data visualization and the narratives to go with it, automated. So, again, work in progress. And then lastly, a few examples on the commercial side. So we have developed an in-house sort of system. It's called AZ Brain. And what we do is we look at data, we pull together data from different sources. So we're getting electronic medical record data, obviously all de-identified because we can't deal with patient data directly, but also data from scripts, from IQVIA, from different sources, diagnostic data, et cetera, et cetera. And we're using all of that to develop a model where it allows our salespeople and it may allow physicians to flag things for them sooner. So a good example is a specific type of cardiomyopathy called ATTR amyloidosis, but it presents as heart failure. Now, a lot of times patients go through multiple doctors and specialists, et cetera, and it may take them 6 months to actually get a proper diagnosis that this is this specific type of cardiomyopathy that's causing heart failure. So, we can use all this data analytics we've done to give specific alerts. We also use it to give alerts to our salespeople that we're seeing in this specific region or this zip code, a greater number of tests done for kidney disease, and go and talk to physicians in this area about products that we have for kidney disease and so forth. So again, that's just examples. Biomarkers, which will become as medicine becomes more and more personalized, there will be an increase in more targeted therapies, more specific biomarkers for that therapy, and again linking the biomarker data with the and picking that up from different sources of data will be important. The challenge with all these different and all of these are great use cases. I think the challenge for the industry and the challenge for us is obviously security. For us and everyone else, making sure the data is secure and used in the appropriate manner. Second, I think data itself, the data quality. As we're starting to use AI more, it's forcing us to look sort of under the rocks and look sort of how our own data is organized and collated and so forth. So again, improving our own data quality, and I'm sure I know a lot of people are in the same boat, but that's another key element that truly will drive how successful AI is. The third challenge, and I think many of us are using this in the same way, AI in the same way, which is to reduce pain points and improve processes. So I think there's a big, eventually it'll help in productivity, but where will be the true transformation is when this allows us to do things we could never do before, or where it's a whole-scale process transformation versus right now it's incremental improvements, reducing cycle time, reducing pain points, et cetera. So, but again, that's going to be an evolution for us as well as the rest of the industry. And then I'll just end on sustainability. As I mentioned, we are leading at least our sector in terms of the goals we have set. So we've set very ambitious goals for Scope 1 and Scope 2 reduction by 98% by 2026, and then a 50% of Scope 3 reduction. In addition, we do have metrics for health equity, the patients that we serve, as well as for inclusion and making sure we have gender equity. I'll, I guess, end there. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Aradhana. Wonderful presentation. Thank you for enlightening us of all the possibilities that you guys are working on and the wonderful work. And with that said, I would love to introduce Chip Cutler from Wall Street Journal. He's a great friend of CCP. And thank you for coming.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, really interesting presentation there. I wonder if we could start sort of big picture, because I think those outside of the pharmaceutical industry have so much hope for AI to solve some of the toughest to crack diseases. And I think you highlighted there that it might be sort of more complicated than many may be expecting. And so I wonder, do we need to temper our optimism a bit, or how should we be thinking about sort of all that AI can really do?
I think technology is definitely an enabler, right? And it will be an enabler. But biology, unfortunately, is way more complex than technology. And so the true innovation comes when we start to understand things which we have never understood before, right? So take Alzheimer's, for example. And other than maybe a certain mutation which explains, a very small percentage of Alzheimer's patients, we still don't know what causes Alzheimer's. But that doesn't mean we won't crack Alzheimer's in the future, right? That I could say that was the same thing for cancers until a few years ago when we started understanding translational science and understanding driver mutations and so on and so forth. We didn't really know what caused cancer, or so I think it will happen, and technology will be a big enabler. But it's also tying all that with continuing to advance understanding of human biology.
Yeah. And so to do all this, how expensive will it be to sort of put AI into sort of way more of your processes? You mentioned sort of the different phases along the way of sort of how a drug gets to market and how it then affects patient care. Do you see sort of needing to make more deals with various AI companies? How do you think about just sort of what it's going to take to do even more of this?
I'm not sure it'll be more deals, at least not necessarily for us. We will obviously tap into different technologies. I think the challenge is, like I said, unfortunately, you cannot shrink the testing process. COVID and COVID vaccines were a very unusual time, and vaccines generally pretty quickly. But if you are developing a cancer drug, you still need to first test it in animals. You still need to first test it that it's not doing any harm in healthy volunteers. And then you test it in cancer patients, and then you have to follow them for 4 years. So I think the randomized clinical trials and so forth, I don't think we could simulate that in an AI world and say, okay, the FDA is not going to say, I'm going to take your simulation in a virtual world, and I'm going to approve a drug based on that data. So I think that portion of the drug development piece is still going to be very hard, and unfortunately not something that there'll be bits and pieces you can solve, but not the whole thing.
Got it. So, and I think a lot of executives in this room are probably also grappling with similar issues about sort of how does AI affect just your workforce composition? I mean, you mentioned you've got close to 84,000 employees who are all doing different tasks. How do you think about sort of how those roles will need to shift? Do you need people in different positions? Where are we sort of in that process in terms of just getting the current workforce to adapt to AI?
So the workforce will definitely need to adapt. And in fact, particularly in finance and other places, we are pushing more upskilling for everybody. And making tools and information and training, et cetera, available. Again, there'll be people who will be quicker to adapt and will come up with great ideas, and people who may be slightly slower to adapt. But I think, and also a lot of the roles are like very technical and very specialized. And you need everyone from the younger people who are quick to adapt and have ideas to leaders who sort of see the vision and the improvement that this technology can bring within their function. So I think you need both, but it will shift. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. So we were talking a little bit about this backstage. I cover corporate news at the Journal, but it feels like we're all sort of Washington reporters these days. We're all thinking about sort of what the next administration is going to mean for corporate America and for all of us. And so I just wonder, when you're thinking about the incoming Trump administration, and obviously there's the RFK Jr. factor at HHS, how do you think about developing relationships with the next administration? Because I'm talking to a lot of executives who, for example, are trying to get one-on-one meetings with President-elect Trump right now. They're trying to think about sort of who is the circle of power. How do we sort of get our positions in front of them? How are you approaching this at AstraZeneca?
So I can't comment specifically on the new administration since it's not there yet. But we have shifted over the last couple of years how we work with governments. And I'll give you a view of the U.S. and I'll also give you a view of outside the U.S. So in the U.S., there was an industry organization called PhRMA. And most of the industry participants sort of worked with that industry organization, to sort of give our view for policies and so on and so forth. So a couple of years ago, we chose, and so did many other pharma companies, chose to exit that industry organization. We are still part of an industry organization called BIO, which is much more focused on smaller companies, but more innovative therapies and so forth. And we decided to sort of build our own corporate affairs relationships and direct relationships in states and in DC and so forth. So that's sort of how we have approached it in the U.S. And we'll continue to build relationships with the new administration as it comes. I do think that the new administration and the human ingenuity that exists in the U.S. will still very much reward innovation and power innovation, which is why last week we did our third quarter call and we announced a total of $3.5 billion investment in the U.S. because this is still very much a country that's going to reward innovation and drive innovation and has strong economy and so forth. Outside the U.S., so we, during COVID, and a lot of people don't know this, but during COVID, AstraZeneca is not a vaccine company. But during COVID, we worked with the University of Oxford and we developed a vaccine. And we supplied that vaccine, billions of doses of vaccine at a no profit, no loss. So we made no money on the vaccine. And 2/3 of those vaccines were supplied to low middle income countries. Because of that work that we did, it created so much goodwill with governments and policymakers, across the globe, and we've leveraged that to further those relationships, worked with them on building healthcare system resilience, and actually, and doing that on a country by country basis. So. I gave you two examples of both U.S. and ex-U.S.
Yeah. So obviously that goodwill is there, and I just wonder, sort of just when you think about just any new administration, how do you sort of just get on their radar? Would you think about just engaging new lobbying firms? I've talked to some executives, for example, who are trying to come up with efficiency ideas to think about if it's this Department of Government efficiency that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and others are running. Hey, maybe we're a company, we have efficiency ideas, we know you care about this. This is a way that we can all intersect. I wonder, what are you thinking about some of stuff like that? How do you just do this? How do you develop better relationship with the new administration?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know if I was going to ask our corporate affairs people if they've come up with ideas to serve to the Doge,
yes.
But I don't think they have yet. But we'll see. It's hard to say. But we will engage with the right policymakers and people as we always do.
And last Washington question, but how do you think about sort of, given all that's next, are you developing a bunch of scenarios? Are you doing a bunch of scenario planning right now to sort of think about, how the Trump administration might change some of its policies, what that might mean for you? I mean, are you in the middle of all of that right now, or do you sort of hold off?
We actually don't. I mean, we do a lot of scenario planning, but not relating to the government, because those are oftentimes things we don't control, or we don't control at all. But we do scenario planning, but more relating to risk that we can manage. So when we do our risk framework, we look at, things that are within our control and things that are not within our control, and government sort of falls not within your control. And then, the low, medium, high impact, and things that are within your control are, what new scientific discoveries you may fund, or, what phase 3 you choose to develop, or what investment you put behind AI. Like, those are things that you can control and can have low, medium, high impact. And sort of that's where we focus and do our scenario planning.
Yeah. So I want to return to sort of our topic. Thank you. That was super helppful. The topic of AI. When we think about sort of these big goals that you outlined by 2030, and you mentioned sort of, getting your workforce upskilled, who internally is responsible for thinking about just like, what roles are we going to need? Which ones will we not? How do we think about just shifting entire departments? Where do you think you are sort of in that journey overall. And will you need close to 84,000 employees a decade from now? Like, what is that? Like, how do you just plan for all of that?
So this is not something that one person can be accountable for. Like I said, because we have such specialized areas, somebody who's a regulatory expert or CMC expert, and so I would say this is the responsibility of all the senior leaders, and actually all of them have sort of embraced that responsibility because again, they need to make the work that they're doing more efficient. They need to plan for this $80 billion ambition. It's not going to happen on its own. So a lot of people have embraced this ambition and the new technologies and saying, what do we need to do with our people? What do we, where are things we can cut? Where do we need to invest? And it's the joint responsibility of all senior leaders in the company.
Great. And how far along, when you think about just sort of the role that AI plays in all these different stages, like where would you say, if you had to sort of rate like what phase we're in? I mean, is AI sort of 25% there and helping sort of with, where you eventually think it could go, or like how do you sort of just categorize the progress so far?
I think that's hard to say. I think I would just be speculating, and again, the truth is always very different than you think it is. But it's also very much dependent on ourselves and us as a human race and companies as to what we do with it. I think nobody would have envisioned what the internet would do, and AI has been sort of likened to the internet, but I'm not sure that's exactly correct. But again, it's things that we don't foresee today where it may add a lot of value. So we just don't know.
Yeah. And when you talk to your peers at other pharmaceutical companies and you think about just sort of all the opportunities with AI, like what comes up in those conversations? What are you all sort of trying to get your arms around? Like what else is sort of, being discussed behind the scenes that you think might be relevant to executives in different industries?
I think a lot of the AI, so a couple of things come up. One is everybody I've talked to is doing use cases, and that makes sense. I think once we and that's generally the first phase of experimenting, right? You do a use case. The question then is, of these use cases, what can you truly scale? And I think scaling will sort of be the second phase of people using AI. I think the other thing that comes up very often is, again, all the stuff that I talked about, right? It's removing bottlenecks, it's improving efficiency. I have not talked to, and at least not in our sector, people who are saying, well, we're doing a whole scale, this process, we're completely changing it with AI. Like that it's incremental improvements, it's removing pain, it's making things more efficient, reducing time. So it's more efficiency and productivity driven than whole-scale transformation.
And I guess then finally, just to end, like, how do you think personally, how do you try to stay sort of up to date on sort of all that AI could do? How do you sort of ensure that you
hang out with younger people?
Is that right? Does that work? Like, what is it? Like, what has worked for you to make sure that you're ahead of everything, that where AI can make a difference, where it can't, what needs, what deserves further investment, what doesn't, like,
It does require, personal time investment, which I try to make, and also learning from peers or from people in other industries. So, it's my own. I spend time on my own learning, and you asked about workforce. One of the things is not just upskilling on AI, but more and more when we look at our workforce, we're selecting for learning agility. Because this is just one example. But as time goes on, and we've seen the pace of change being very rapid, you want people more in your workforce that have learning agility rather than, okay, I have full knowledge of ABC. It's, the ABC may be less relevant in 4 years. So I think developing that learning agility in people and the enthusiasm and passion to learn is something that I try to drive and do myself.
And I think setting up, like, you hear a lot about agile organizations too. Like, how do you set up a structure that can shift and morph and change? I mean, to me, that's another part of this that is super challenging for a lot of companies to really do and practice. I don't know if you've sort of cracked the code on that or figure out how do we sort of just proceed when the organization is really going to have to shift, I would imagine.
Yeah, it is going to have to shift, and I think corporate leaders will also need to shift their thinking on what used to be very much org structure, and this is how. So I think org structures will need to shift, maybe become more fluid over time. But that's not. That's just a journey, and we'll have to figure that out as we go.
Yeah, terrific conversation. So much here. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good to see you. Thank you.